Good afternoon. My name is Matt Howard. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at Virtru. I'd like to welcome you today to a quick conversation, hash it out, with my colleague Shannon Vaughn. Shannon, we saw some interesting news yesterday where the U.S. Department of Defense was reported in TechCrunch to have left an email server exposed to the public. Curious to kind of get your quick reaction to that.
Well, I would say first, frustrating, right? Frustrating here. How many times have we heard about human error causing one of these things? And I think what's most frustrating is how much data was essentially sitting out there for how long, especially knowing that it's in support of U.S. Special Operations Command, when we already have solutions to prevent this kind of error, human error.
So with that in mind, I mean, let's just sort of step back for a second and sort of reflect real quick on what was actually reported. Apparently, it's an email server that's hosted, I think, in the low side of the Microsoft Azure cloud. We don't exactly know what type of email server. Probably safe to assume it's an Exchange server. What we know is that the public disclosure was yesterday, February 21st, and 21st in TechCrunch. According to the article, it's February 7th that the White Hat researcher sort of discovered and reported responsibly, apparently to SOCOM, that this is an email server that's publicly exposed to the web, and you might want to do something about it. And I think it was like 14 days later that the patch was effectively made and then publicly reported. Does that sound about right to you?
Yeah, there's only been a couple reports on it, but yeah, that's what I've read and heard.
And so I guess one of the big questions is potentially is how long was it exposed to the public internet prior to the White Hat researcher discovering it on February 7th?
Yeah, I think that's the big unknown. I mean, I'd love my White Hat researchers. They help to scan for vulnerabilities. They notify. They do everything the right way. But it openly says in the articles that there's data dating back years. And when you talk about what data that is, they say, oh, we see DoD ID numbers, which is considered PII, right? Controlled unclassified information. They say we see SF-86, which is the clearance paperwork, right, to get your security clearance. Security clearance is not just about that individual. It's about all the people that they know, their work history, their past experiences. It has your social. It has your home address. It has your spouse. It has their social. It has your family. Has people that you know. I mean, there's a lot of sensitive information that goes into an SF-86.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the point. So we should be collectively as a community careful not to assume that just because this server was, quote unquote, unclassified, that it did not contain indeed truly sensitive information, whether that's PII or, to your point, these clearance documents. It's ultimately very sensitive information that probably existed on this server. I'm kind of curious, when we step back and think about that for a moment, and we think about our tools and our kits collectively as an industry, how much of that information do you think might have been encrypted? So like if somebody were to have had access to this and they were to have exfiltrated everything on the server, do you think any of it was encrypted?
I don't know if it was. Should some of it have been? Yes. We work at Virtru. We like encryption, but I think you and I both agree, and I think pretty much the entire company agrees, not everything needs to be encrypted. But there are rules, there are mandates that for CUI data, for FOUO data, that has to be protected, and encryption is one of the ways to protect. We already have, capabilities that do this, right? So you could do a DLP, DRM kind of scanning tool like we have. Everybody has kind of these lower level capabilities to allow humans to make errors, because I don't think any company has 100% perfect employees, right? Humans have faults.
So if we just step back and imagine, in a practical sense, maybe there was a DLP, in the workflow, and maybe sensitive emails that were being sent internally, because this was an internal email server, as I understand it,
Yep.
Might have been flagged by the DLP for encryption, in which case some of those more sensitive emails that would have been discovered on that email by anyone attempting to exfiltrate might have been met with an encrypted blob. That would be the best case, because at least not everything would have been sort of just exposed in the wild. At least some of it would have been encrypted. But to your point, not all of it would have been encrypted, because nobody wants to encrypt everything. That's just not the way the world really works. You want to use encryption judiciously for the things that are truly sensitive. And to your point, it really helps to do that with some type of automation in the workflow with the DLP to along those lines. Does that sound about reasonable to you?
Yeah, I think it sounds reasonable. The question is, what, crypto algorithm did they use? Right?
Yeah,
I mean,
no, I think that's important. We should probably poke at that for just a second, because I don't know if I remember if it was December. It was towards the end of last year. There was another white hat researcher that publicly disclosed that they had reported responsibly to Microsoft a vulnerability in the Office messaging encryption algorithm used by Microsoft to encrypt emails with OME. And the white hat researcher reported that there was a vulnerability in the cipher because it was weak and it was subject to someone potentially, having access to a sufficient number of emails, even though they were encrypted. If you have enough emails, quote unquote, training data, pattern matching, you could basically infer the context of the underlying email without having to decrypt it. Yep. When do you recall when that was?
Yeah, it was late last year. I think it was right after Thanksgiving. But yeah, that's exactly right. If only an adversary had a treasure trove of data that dates back years. So even if it was encrypted using kind of OME, well, guess what? You got some really good training data, right? You could probably build a good pattern matching capability against that, and then decrypt those underlying files. And that's best case. That's if it was encrypted.
Right. And what's interesting about this, I mean, if anybody's followed this in the public domain, because it's been sort of reported on, at least in the technical community, Microsoft's response to the white hat researcher who originally reported the vulnerability to them was, after investigating it, they determined that it's in fact not a vulnerability, and that they don't intend to patch it. And that's how it's intended to work, so they can do things like discovery and so forth. It certainly is interesting to kind of reflect on how the world kind of goes around, but now we see ourselves here today. One of the questions that was asked, was how likely is it that somebody could effectively steal a huge number of emails, or enough emails, sufficient emails, to basically do the pattern matching to infer the context of the copy of the underlying messages. Well, I mean, as we know from yesterday's news, it's probably not that unlikely.
Yeah. I think that's exactly right. And what is the data, right? That's the thing that I think really gets at me. I'm now in the Army Reserves, but almost 19 years in, how many times have I sent data, especially on an internal system, where I'm more willing to share information, right? So if I'm sending information to my G1, S1, J1, whoever it is, that's my personnel group. Well, I'm going to send them all of my DoD ID number, my social, whatever that information is, SF86, right? If I'm going to the security folks, if I'm going to the 2 shop, like if I know that this is an internal only system, well, great. Hey, I'll share that and not expect any risk. Well, next thing you know, human error, no password, it's exposed. How long has it been exposed? And now, me, myself, my family, everybody I know's SF86, information is in my SF86, and now they're now targeted because one person made a mistake.
Yeah, no, it's a sobering situation we find ourselves in. You and I both know how hard it is to do, cybersecurity and data-centric security in particular, really well at scale. These types of incidents are all too common. I do think that as we reflect on this, we should all be careful not to, revel in anybody's, sort of difficult situation. I think it's also incumbent upon us to ask really important questions about how you can do better. I'm just quickly curious, how would you do better if it were you and you could rewind the clock a bit?
I mean, as I said, we've got it. Everybody's kind of got it. There are tools already in place where you can automate away a lot of these problem sets, right? So when data goes out, you should probably have a scanning tool. We have a scanning tool. Microsoft actually has a scanning tool. I hope they did it. If you're going to encrypt, ideally you use a better encryption module, right? We really like AES-256 GCM, but have kind of these common capabilities implemented, and then make sure that the data that it goes out is effectively being tagged or encrypted where necessary. I mean, it's nothing bigger than that, I don't believe.
Yeah, and so hygiene matters, both in terms of how you do data-centric security with respect to things like DLP and encryption of emails, but let's not forget that hygiene very much matters with respect to do you or don't you put a password on the server, which of course is probably a mistake that should be avoided at all cost, and hopefully will not happen again. So listen, I appreciate you taking the time to compare notes on this. It's fresh off the press, so to speak, and it's always good to kind of just get perspective from someone like yourself who's an expert in the industry. So thanks for making the time.
Yeah, thanks, Matt.